Hello, everybody. In our Parsha, we have the laws of Pesach, and along with it, the laws of Pesach Sheni. But Rashi, based on a Medrash, notes a difficulty. The book of Bamidbar, chapter 1, opens with events that took place in year 2 of the wanderings in the desert in the month of Iyar. Yet the instruction regarding to observe Pesach in year 2, along with the laws of Pesach Sheni, occurred a month earlier in the month of Nisan. And so Rashi, paraphrasing the Gemara in Masechet Psachim, notes that we see from here a mukdam u'me'uchar b'Torah. Events described in chapter 1 did not necessarily occur before events described in chapter 9. But yet one wonders, why would we take things out of their chronological order? There must have been a reason. And so Rashi, based on the Medrash, suggests that the whole incident and reference to the law of bringing a korban Pesach and Pesach Sheni is a critique of the behavior of Am Yisrael, because throughout their decades of wandering in the desert, the only time they brought a korban Pesach was here in year 2. And for the remaining years of their wandering, they never again brought a korban Pesach. But one wonders, is this really a critique of Am Yisrael? Does this speak of their detriment? After all, are we even sure that they were obligated to bring a korban Pesach? Are we sure that they failed in any which way? The Torah tells us in Sefer Shemot, "V'haya ki tavo el haaretz asher yitein Hashem lachem ka'asher diber u'shmartem et ha'avodah hazot." The Torah commands the Jews to keep the ritual of korban Pesach, but it seems to be predicated with the introductory clause, "V'haya ki tavo el haaretz," when you come to Eretz Yisrael. Masechet Kiddushin records a difference of opinion as to the significance of the expression, "and when you shall come to the land." There is one obvious school of thought that says it's telling us that this mitzvah kicks in only after Yerusha v'yeshiva, after you have conquered the land, divided it amongst the tribes, and have settled therein. And thus, if that's the approach, then we see that the ritual of korban Pesach did not apply bichlal in the desert, albeit there is an alternative approach, that the expression "v'haya ki tavohu" is not a prerequisite, but rather is a result in the merit of keeping particular mitzvot, such as korban Pesach. You shall merit to inherit Eretz Yisrael, in which case the Jews may very well have been obligated in the mitzvah of korban Pesach in the desert. With this approach, it's obvious what the critique of Am Yisrael is. They didn't do it for most of their years of wandering. But according to the first approach, the Jews were not even commanded to keep the mitzvah. So what is the detriment here that we note, well, this was the only time they did it, when there was a special command for year 2? So there are those who suggest there's a reason why the Jews were not subsequently commanded for the remainder of their journey to keep the mitzvah of korban Pesach. And that's because of the Chet Meraglim. Without the Chet Meraglim, the Jews within a matter of days would have entered Eretz Yisrael. But because of that sin, they were destined to wander for 40 years. And hence, the embarrassment and critique of Am Yisrael is the punishment of wandering, where the mitzvah of korban Pesach would no longer be relevant until such time as they are to enter Eretz Yisrael. But even so, why didn't Moshe ask the people to keep the mitzvah? And the standard answer that is given is because there were so many newborn males whom they could not circumcise because of the hazardous journey, that therefore, since they were arei lim and couldn't participate, so the mitzvah of Karban Pesach was held in abeyance. But the lie is given to that, if you will, by the fact that in year 2, even though there were already so many arei lim, non-circumcised, nonetheless, the divine command to observe Karban Pesach was in effect. This only tells us that our original supposition, that the fact that they wandered for 40 years and thus were not going to keep the Karban Pesach, was not the original plan, and thus it speaks in a critical manner of the behavior of Am Yisrael, not per se that they didn't keep the Karban Pesach, but that they had committed another sin that prevented the divine command to observe Pesach for all those additional punishment years in the desert. I saw in Oznaim LaTorah of Rav Zalman Sorotzkin a very interesting approach. And it actually is rooted in the laws of Pesach Sheni. In year 2, in the month of Nisan, when the command came forward to keep Pesach, the Jews who at that time were Tameim, ritually defiled and thus not able to partake in Karban Pesach, they came to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, why should we be excluded? Why should we be denied the opportunity to observe this beautiful mitzvah? Lama nigara. And thus was born the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni, an opportunity a month later in the month of Iyar to observe the ritual of Karban Pesach. The critique of Am Yisrael is as follows. Fine, they had sinned. Thus they were going to, because of Chet Meraglim, wander for so many additional years in which they would be bereft of a commandment to keep Karban Pesach. But didn't it bother any of them? Why was it that nobody spoke up and said, Lama nigara? Why shouldn't we be able to keep this precious mitzvah of Karban Pesach, which reminds us of our genesis as a nation, even as we're being punished for additional years of wandering in the desert? It's almost as if nobody cared, as if they looked at mitzvot not as opportunities to draw closer to Hashem, but as obligations, which in fact they are, but in the sense of it being an onus, a burden. So if God's going to say you don't have to keep Karban Pesach in years 3 and onward of their wanderings in the desert, great. We're free. We don't have to do it. And that speaks of a corrupt attitude towards what it means to observe the mitzvah of Hashem. I think of this, for example, in a case, let's say, where for one reason or another, on a Monday and Thursday, in Shachris, where we generally recite a pretty long version of Tachanun, where, let's say, there's a Baal Simcha that exempts the congregation from saying Tachanun, the typical attitude of people is, great, we don't have to say that whole long Vahurachum, etc. In other words, what that's showing, if we really stop to think about it, is that, yes, every Monday and Thursday we do our duty and we say the whole Vahurachum. But if there's any way we could get out of it, lovely. And instead of looking at tefillah as an opportunity to pour our hearts out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to petition Him, to beseech Him, to feel close to Him, we look at it as an obligation. And we fulfill the obligation when we're told we must. But the better attitude for Am Yisrael is to look at every mitzvah as an opportunity, as a way that Hashem wants us to feel close to Him, to feel His presence, to feel His influence. That was the Genut, that for nearly 40 years, nobody cried out, why can't we do the Korban Pesach? Shabbat Shalom u'mevorach.